Today at the National Press Club, Domestic, Family and Sexual Violence Commissioner Micaela Cronin. Tasked with ensuring the national plan to prevent violence against women is kept on track, the Commissioner will deliver her first update on its progress as the country faces surging rates of intimate partner homicide. Micaela Cronin with today's National Press Club address.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the National Press Club and the Westpac Address, where we are meeting on Ngunnawal and Ngambri land, Canberra. My name's Laura Tingle, I'm the club's president. Domestic violence is hardly a new problem, but it has become frontline news in Australia in the past couple of years, with what seem a relentless series of horrendous incidents putting this issue in the national focus. Today we get the first progress report on how we are dealing with this issue as a nation. Please welcome Domestic, Family and Sexual Violence Commissioner Micaela Cronin to address us with her first inaugural yearly report to the Parliament.
Thank you, Laura. Thank you to the Press Club for this incredible opportunity to talk about what is such an important issue, and thank you to Morris and the board for welcoming us here today. I want to begin by acknowledging that we are meeting on the lands of the Ngunnawal and Ngambri people and pay my respects to Aboriginal communities and elders of these lands and for all that they have done to care for the lands in Canberra for many, many generations, and all that we have to learn from Aboriginal controlled organisations who are in many ways at the forefront and leading much of the work in addressing family, domestic and sexual violence. I think some of my observations would be that some of the best practice is led by Aboriginal communities and Aboriginal controlled organisations. There are many people I want to acknowledge in this room, and I'm going to start by acknowledging the lived experience advocates who are here today. There are many people who are here today in the room. Thank you for being here. There are many who I know are watching, and there are many who know nothing about the Press Club but have very generously shared with us throughout the time that we had since the Commission was established. I particularly want to acknowledge members of the Inaugural Lived Experience Advisory Council who are here, and Alison Scott, who is the co-chair of the council. Thank you all for being here today. There's a long list. I need to make sure I look at my notes to make sure I remember people. I want to acknowledge Jenna Roberts, who is the Assistant Commissioner in the Domestic, Family and Sexual Violence Commission, and thank her for her support. Vanessa Turnbull-Edwards, who is the inaugural Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Children and Young People's Commissioner for the ACT. Thank you for being here, Ness. Secretary Griggs, thank you for being here. Assistant Minister Justine Elliott, thank you, and I really want to acknowledge the consistent support you have given to the office in terms of the importance of the independence of the office since we've been established. So I really want to acknowledge what you have done in that regard. Thank you, Assistant Commissioner. Laura and Morris have said we've had some significant interest today, so thank you very much, Susan Ley, Honourable Susan Ley, Deputy Opposition Leader, for being here. Zoe Daniels, MP, Senator Larissa Waters, Sheena Watt, MP, and I understand Senator Dorinda Cox as well is joining us today. Oh, there you are. Thank you. I also want to acknowledge that my daughter is here. Thank you, Lilith, for being here. Yeah. Don't want to get emotional right from the beginning, but there are many people that I am feel very honoured who have made the effort to be here today. Thank you. I want to begin by making some comments about just how powerfully important the language we use is. I want to open by saying that my pronouns are she, her. And in saying that, I acknowledge that gender is not binary, and that celebrating and valuing diversity of gender rather than oppressing and and hiding that. The celebration of diversity is a significant key to addressing gender-based violence. The way we use language is important. We have come a long way from talking about violence, domestic violence, and equating it with a black eye. We are much more sophisticated in understanding that it is now about patterns of behaviour, and talk about coercive control and the need to talk about social and systemic entrapment. So language is important. We often talk about violence, but when we say that, it's important to recognise that it is broader than physical violence. We also often use quite passive language. We talk about violence against women rather than men's violence. We use language that doesn't make it as visible as it needs to be, that it's predominantly men who perpetrate violence and it is predominantly women. We talk about missing and lost women and children rather than women who have been actively disappeared and murdered. We need to be stronger and clearer and use less passive language. Last thing I want to say about language is that when we talk about, we often it trips off, it's not a great phrase to trip off the tongue, but domestic, family and sexual violence. We are not talking as much about sexual violence, and we rarely use the word incest. We need to be making it more, we need to talk more about sexual violence, and I'll talk a bit more about that throughout my speech. Today is we've tabled the first inaugural yearly report on the National Plan. The National Plan was launched nearly 2 years ago. In the time since the Commission was established, and Australia created we are only one of 3 countries in the world that has established a National Domestic, Family and Sexual Violence Commission. I started in the role on the 1st of November, so just over a year and a half ago. In that time, I've spoken to thousands of people. We've held 8 roundtables at which over 300 people participated and contributed significantly their views and their perspectives and their wisdom and knowledge, and all of that input has contributed significantly to this report. I've spoken at dozens of conferences and we've had hundreds of stakeholder meetings. All of those things have formed part of what is the body of this report. The report broadly speaks to government in progress against the national report. But I'm going to today focus on 3 specific themes that we've raised in the report. One is lived experience and the critical importance of embedding the perspectives of lived experience, the deep wisdom that lived experience advocates bring across all aspects of the work that we need to do to end gender-based violence. The second theme I will talk about is men and engaging men in this conversation. The National Plan uses the word men 129 times. It uses the word women 543 times, 4 times more than we talk about men. We need to be talking with and about men more. The third theme I'm going to talk about is the vital importance of building both the capacity and capability of our system to respond to the crisis emergency that we are facing collectively. When I took up the role on the 1st of November 2022, my first decision as Commissioner was that I wanted to get out of the office straight away and get around the country before the end of the year. The first place I went to was Northern Territory, and that was quite intentional, and I went and spent time in Alice Springs. The week before I started, on the 24th of October, was the airing of the Murdered and Missing report, the Four Corners report, which I have subsequently gone back and watched a couple of times. It's incredibly powerful and moving, and I want to acknowledge that the inquiry was tabled last Thursday, and again I'll refer to that a bit more. But at the opening of the Four Corners investigative report, Shirlene Campbell she's talking at a rally, and she absolutely implores us. She says, "We are not just numbers. Do you hear me? We are not numbers. We are humans." And Shirlene is an amazing person, and her words and the words of other lived experience advocates that I have spoken to absolutely are with me in this role all of the time. So in talking about that as one of the key themes, some of the points that we make in the report in terms of what needs to happen in terms of engaging lived experience, it's really important that it's not a tick-the-box exercise, that it's not a, here's something we've already prepared, tell us what you think about it. One of the things that we know, and the productivity report talked about, where the best practice is happening in terms of closing the gap is where it's community-led. Community-led initiatives where the problems are identified and described by the community that know them best. Lived experience advocates, so people who choose to share their stories, often at great personal expense. It's not easy to get up and talk about yourself and the details of what's happened to you. People make a choice to do that. We know that there will be many people in this room, many of us who have personal experiences of domestic, family and sexual violence. But I really want to honour and respect and value the people who choose to put their hands up and be advocates, and to make that an important part of often their life's work. So we need to respect and value it. We need to recognise it in every step of the way, all the way through from defining problems through to really meaningful evaluations, and then transparently sharing those evaluations, designing solutions, testing solutions. Is this going to work in your community? Just because it works somewhere else doesn't necessarily mean it's going to translate. We are an incredibly diverse country. What's going to work in a remote Aboriginal community is very different than what's going to work in Redfern, than what's going to work in a capital city. We need to be paying attention to and listening to those communities about what's important for them, what's going to change the dial for them. The Commission established the first Lived Experience Advisory Council, and I want to acknowledge one of the first things we did was to ask some lived experience advocates to join with us from the very beginning in designing that process. So thank you to those of you who are here today. You made a huge difference, and I learnt every time we met with you, and was often very challenged with having forgotten something. So thank you for your courage and perseverance and hanging in there with us. That council is doing important work. We are building the work. Government is eagerly asking to meet with that group. I think one of the things that we know, and again that I have absolutely heard from our council members and other advocates and other councils around the country that have been doing this work, is that part of what we need to do is help educate government about how to make the most of the opportunity of engaging with those people. What are all the things that we need to wrap around those processes to make the most of the generosity of people who are prepared to share some of their deepest personal pain and experiences in order to change systems. One of the things I have consistently heard from nearly every advocate I have met with is an urgent passion to tell me about their experience, to share with us, because they don't want anybody else to experience what they have. And they're talking about our systems failures predominantly. They're not coming to say, I want you to help me and fix what happened to me. They want to change the future for other people. They want to change the present for other people. I think The other thing I think that is incredibly powerful about lived experience and the engagement and the importance of storytelling is the truth-telling element of it. You can't look away when someone is telling you their own personal truth. You can't refer to data. You can't say, well, we're funding this program. You can't, you just have to be with the person and listen to their story. Truth-telling is incredibly important, and it holds us to the fact that everybody is here in this room because we know how urgent this issue is. The last financial year up to 30 June, 43 women were murdered in intimate partner violence. Numbers are much larger than that if you start to include people, women, children who die as a result of family, domestic and sexual violence. We've seen an 11% increase in sexual violence in the last year. First Nations women are 33 times more likely to be hospitalised, 6 times more likely to die. And 60% of LGBTQI+ people will have experienced family, domestic or intimate partner violence in their lives. That's what many people's lives are like today and always. And it's not something that many people want to look in the face all of the time. It is something that advocates are courageously and bravely bringing to our attention so that we can do something about this. One of the things that I have also consistently heard everywhere I've gone, and it was one of the things that to be honest, I was a bit surprised about when I first went to Northern Territory and Alice Springs and then Queensland, was work with our men. Please work with our men. It wasn't what I was expecting to be hearing. And to be honest, if I'd been standing up here on the 1st of November 2022, it might not have been one of the themes that I would have highlighted in terms of what I think we need to be talking about. But we need to be having very different conversations with men. We need to be recognising and we need to be engaging with men in different ways than we are now. We need to have eyes on men in different ways than we do now. We need to be listening to what communities, women and children mean when they say we need greater accountability. We need men to be held accountable in ways that they are not being at the moment. Part of the complexity, and one of the things I really, when I was thinking about what I wanted to talk to you all about today, is there's a real complexity in this conversation of holding things at the same time. At the same time that we know that men as a group hold more power in our community, are more in control of decision making than women are. At the same time as that is true, we also know that individual men are vulnerable, struggling to understand what being a good man in this day and age is. We held a round table at the end of last year, and 2 of the men who stood up at that round table talked about the struggle of being a good man and not feeling like they were living up to the expectations that society puts on them. We know there's a big debate about young men and online misogyny. We are watching a generation grow up with access to online misogyny, pornography, hate speak in a way that we've never seen before. And we're really struggling as a community with how to deal with that. And what we hear from young men is that they are attracted to what some of the voices that they are hearing, and I'm not going to name them, are saying, because it gives them some sense of how to be a man. We need to get better. We need to get better at talking to those young men. We need to get better at listening to them. We need men to be leading those conversations, and I'm very pleased to see more men in the room today. Thank you. It requires leadership from men and women to be having the conversation that we need to have to end gender-based violence. The other thing we really desperately need is more data, about more and better data about men. We do not know enough about trajectories into using violence and out of using violence, how to help men who we don't have enough services available when men call and say, hey, I'm a bit worried about my behaviour. And we know, I've talked to many service providers who say they are getting those calls and that there is nothing that they can offer at the moment, very little that they can offer. There are some very good... One of the other things I really want to communicate today is that while I'm sharing where I'm seeing a lot of the challenges, the other thing I've been hearing about is, with a great deal of energy in the community, is the hope and the work that is underway. One of the things I have resoundingly heard is that people back the national plan. The national plan gives us a framework to do the complex work that we're doing, and that people felt heard in the consultation that was part of the incredibly deep and extensive consultation that happened in building that national plan. So there are examples of very good practice that is happening about options for men who are either themselves reaching out because they're concerned about their behaviour, or who are being referred by the courts because the courts say you need to do something about your behaviour. But there's not enough. There needs to be a lot more. We need standards. We need consistent practice. We need data that tells us more about what those pathways are. When I talk about those systems, then it leads me to my third theme, which is about the importance of building the capacity and capability of our systems. As I've said, one of the things that we have also consistently heard is that despite having seen very, very significant increases in funding over periods of time, over the last decades really, our service systems are overwhelmed, stretched beyond capacity. They are struggling to hold on to staff, and they are really at wit's end about how are they going to meet the needs, because as we know, the better we get, the more reforms we see, the more hope. The hope is we will see more women reporting. We will see more people coming forward seeking help. We've already got a service system that is buckling. We know that, so we need to do more work across the board about building the capacity of the system to respond to that. But we need to understand the demand better than we do as well. We don't really understand, again and again there is good work underway about this, but we need to know more about where is that demand. Where are the areas that we really need to be prioritising and putting that funding into? We need to be thinking about, demand. We need to be increasing service options. I think one of the things that we would all note is that this year, and Laura mentioned it at the beginning, we've seen a real increase again in attention. We've seen rallies around the country, in communities, local communities, people coming together. I went to the rally in Geelong when there was the first series of rallies. I went to the rally in Geelong because that's where my Auntie Sue died after having lived with domestic and sexual violence for many years. And I found it incredibly moving being part of a community and being able to just be present with those people. We know that what those people, and again, it was one of the things I found being part of the crowd in Geelong was that it was community. It was men, women, children, very diverse people in the local, mall. What they were there and what they were talking about and what we have heard across the country is no more. We need this to stop. We need our systems to do better. Molly Ticehurst was murdered on the 22nd of April in Forbes, and we know the system failed her. Everybody knows that. The Northern Territory Coroner Elizabeth Armitage has been conducting an inquest that is coming to its end and into the killings of 4 Aboriginal women: Kumanjaya, Hayward, Nyago, Ragurk, Miss Unipingo and Kumar Rabunja. I wanted to say their names because so often we don't hear the names of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander women, and that's an important inquest, and I look forward to reading her findings when she does share them. First Nations women, as the missing and murdered inquiry report calls out last week, First Nations women and children are more likely to go missing and less likely to be found. They are over-policed in most aspects of their lives and under-policed in their safety. We need our systems to do better. One of the things that we've called out as part of the report is the need for addressing workforce issues. So it's really interesting. I've been having conversations across the board. I've had lots of conversations across the police workforces, health workforces, education workforces, and all of them are under enormous pressure. But one of the things that I wanted to really highlight in our report is that we need a national, joined-up approach to a workforce strategy that looks at all of the elements and activates all of the elements of the workforce that touches domestic, family and sexual violence every day. We have, and it was really hard to get this data, and we will get it better next year. I'm determined we will get it by jurisdiction next year. But nationally, we have about 9,000 people working in the domestic, family and sexual violence sector. We have about 80,000 in our police workforce. We have about 800,000 in the health sector. We need the health sector to recognise and the police workforce to recognise that domestic, family and sexual violence is core business. It's not somebody else's business. And we need to build the capability of those workforces to respond appropriately and well when they have an opportunity, because we know that, as I was saying before, about wherever there is a touch point, we need to see that as an opportunity. We need to see it as an opportunity for prevention, for preventing the cycle continuing, for preventing further harm. If it's a police officer turning up to an incident of domestic violence, that's an opportunity for those officers to act in a way that contributes to healing and recovery in the respect and the way that they talk to everybody who is in the room, including the children. It's an opportunity to intervene in a way that can prevent further violence, both for that family, but also for other families. We know that many men, when there haven't been eyes on them, when there hasn't been an opportunity for healing and recovery, move on to other women and children. So every point we have an opportunity, we need to be activating that in thinking about it as an opportunity and a responsibility to be thinking about healing and recovery, appropriate trauma-informed, shame-sensitive responses, early intervention and healing and recovery, really critically. So we need to be educating. When someone turns up to a GP and says, I'm a bit worried about my alcohol use, or I've got some mental health issues because my relationship is breaking down, we know if a man is talking to his GP and saying he's got worries, the GP needs to ask them about their behaviour, because we know that relationship breakdowns, pregnancy and new children, we know where there are some of the most high-risk moments in people's lives for violence and homicide. And those are opportunities for GPs, maternal and child health nurses, teachers or counsellors, whoever it is that is having that conversation, to ask the questions, which means we need a consistent approach to educating people about risk assessment and understanding risk and how to manage it. one of the things I want to call out in terms of thinking about our systems is that we know that systems are weaponised. Systems are weaponised to harm people, and all of our systems can be weaponised. We know child support security payments are weaponised. We know the family court is weaponised. Child protection system is weaponised against women and children. The business sector has recognised, and I really want to call out, we held a roundtable with the business sector fairly recently, and some of the work that is being done around safety by design principles. How do you think ahead of time about how something could be used to harm people? And I can tell you the best people that will think about those things in ways that not all of us would immediately do that is lived experience advocates. And the business sector are getting better at ensuring that they are listening to those people and talking and slowing things down. One of the comments that was made at the roundtable was that we've all got really good at speeding things up, that fast is God, going to market fast. And what I was really impressed about in that room was the senior leaders from all parts of the business sector who were talking about we maybe need to insert some friction points in our system so that we can slow things down and check for red flags. Government needs to do the same. Government needs to think about it, and again, this work is happening. I know that the secretaries are doing work and leading work around thinking about how can we look at how our systems are currently being weaponised, what do we need to do to address the current harm that is happening and ensure that it doesn't continue to happen, and think about what needs to happen into the future. So I really want to acknowledge that there is some real leadership being shown in the business sector, and that government has a real leadership role in thinking about both its own systems as well as what the leadership it needs to show across the community. I'm going to close by talking about a couple of things that I think we haven't, and as a community we haven't paid enough attention to yet, and we need to do more. We have consistently talked about, and the National Plan talks about children and young people in their own right. We're not doing it very well yet, and we need to understand why we're not doing it very well, despite the best intentions, despite it being an element of the National Plan. We are going to be really focusing on some work around children and young people and what that actually means, and how do we we had a roundtable, and I've had some conversations with some lived experience youth advocates, and one of the comments was, Connor, if you are listening, Connor Powell said, we are consulted more than we are provided specific services to. There's a lot of consultation going on. We need to get better. We just need to get better at providing services that are led by children and young people. The other thing that we are not, as I said at the beginning, is we are not talking enough about is sexual violence and incest, and we need to do more to talk about that and to be thinking about where there are the intersections with domestic and family violence, and where there are, the Venn diagram of, there are absolutely intersections that are very important. We need the systems to be talking to each other, but there are also things that are different and need to be addressed and dealt with differently. There are different workforce issues. So we need to be thinking about domestic, family and violence and sexual violence specifically. The other thing that we're going to be doing in the coming months, and we are in conversations with the Northern Territory Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Advisory Council about, is Northern Australia and remote and regional Australia, and how we have conversations that are led by those communities, informed by them about what is important to them and what it is that we need to be doing. So those are some of the things that we will be looking at in greater detail as we continue to do the work that we have been tasked by government to continue to do. It couldn't possibly be more urgent than it is. Every single woman whose life is lost, every child whose childhood is scarred and damaged, we have to do better And we have heard from around the country the leadership calls around doing better and the recognition that we need to do better and the commitment to that. And the Commission's, one of the things that I'm always saying to the team is that part of our role is to help find the people. Within every system, there are people who are trying to change that system from within. Let's go find them and let's support them and back them in, because we have a big job to do and we need to work collaboratively across the country to achieve the goal of ending gender-based violence in a generation. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Commissioner. There's two levels of work you're really outlining here. These really long-term changes in how we see ourselves as a society and deal with and confront these issues. And then there's the sort of the pointy bit, as you say, it couldn't be more urgent. Now, I hate reducing everything to money, but that's the pointy end of political and government decisions so often. Community legal centres have already labelled the government's response this morning deeply disappointing, and they're saying they're having to turn away a lot of people. But of course, community legal centres are just one of the real frontline services. If there is one particular issue or one particular area of funding where you would call on the government to make a material change right now, what would it be?
I mean, I think it's a very good question. I do think that the community legal centres often provide an incredibly holistic response, and I don't think that's recognised enough. I think particularly the family violence community legal services do an extraordinary job, and I do think there is recognition of that, and I do think the government has recognised that. I think that I wouldn't call out one area, to be honest. I do think we need a much better understanding of the demand and where that demand is, and that there does need to be an uplift across the board in terms of service responses, because it's very hard to choose, right? I do think that responses for men is critical, and we need that not to be at the expense of response services who are taking calls every day. I think the community legal services do an extraordinary job on the ground of wrapping whatever needs to be done around their services, and they're often not funded to do that. So I think taking a comprehensive view of where are the points in the service system that we need to be really looking at that uplift and across the country is something that all governments need to be urgently paying attention to.
Karen Barlow has a question.
Hello, Karen Barlow from the Saturday paper. Thank you very much for being here. I was just hoping you could explicitly tell us whether the national plan is on track and that the pledge to end gender-based violence within a generation is actually achievable at the current trajectory.
What I would say in terms of what I absolutely would say is that what I have seen and heard across the country is deep commitment from Commonwealth and all state and territory governments to the national plan. We have yet to see the formal reporting data. As I said, this report is on the anniversary of the 2 actions plans being launched last August. So until we see the detailed reporting from those, what we are reporting on is what we have been hearing. I would say that we are on track in many regards. I think that there's some incredible foundational work being done. And I think one of the things that we really wanted to talk about in this report is the hope that exists in terms of some of the investment that often people don't see, and the work that is being done in shining a light on domestic, family and sexual violence. I think the commitment that we are the generation that transforms this country's response to domestic, family and sexual violence is absolutely on track. I do feel very hopeful about the future.
David Crowe.
Thanks, Laura, and thank you, Commissioner, for your address. David Crowe from the Sydney Morning Herald and the Age of Melbourne. I'll admit to being a naive journalist because I thought many years ago that years of focus by the federal government on this problem would lead to possibly a generational change. So I'm interested in whether that, on your view of that, because are you seeing any evidence among younger men of a change in behaviour or a change in attitude, for better or for worse? Because you mentioned social media. Clearly there's an incredible amount of rubbish out there that is influencing young minds, which poses a serious social problem. And if you were to support awareness programs aimed at young men, they may be simply overwhelmed by the amount of other content that's out there. So I'm interested in your view of, I guess, the scale of the problem there, whether things are getting better or worse, and whether there's any policy that can come from the federal government that may counter some of that rubbish out there.
Thank you, David. I think that I think we need to recognise that there has been a great deal of change has occurred. It might not necessarily have led to rapid changes in prevalence rates of domestic, family and sexual violence, but there has been significant work done and we are building on that. I think one of the things that I am seeing now and that one of my observations would be is that we are getting better at recognising the systems change that needs to happen, and that, as I said before, that governments need to look at their systems and how they can cause harm. I think no 10-year plan can be a set and forget plan, right? The change that we have all seen in the last couple of years, the change in terms of the conversation we're having about technology facilitated abuse, online misogyny, is different than we were having when the plan was being developed. So we need to keep building on that work. I think we all need to stay on our toes, because I think your point about we haven't necessarily seen the changes that we want to see is very reasonable and real, and we need to make sure that we are. And I think that's part of the Lived Experience Advisory Council's job, is to keep everybody on their toes and keep everybody real about, are we seeing the changes that we expect and that the community expects to see. Thank you, Deb.
Rosie Lewis.
Rosie Lewis from The Australian. I just wanted to ask you, on your quote where you say we need to have eyes on men in a different way, you did give a couple of examples through your speech. I'm just wondering if you can expand on that, particularly in the home, but also within business, within workplaces and within the Parliament. Just on the Parliament, today we have new legislation on an independent Parliamentary Standards Commissioner, I hope that's its right name, where it will make recommendations to politicians on poor behaviour and how to treat the poor behaviour. Ultimately, it's up to what's called the Privileges Committee, senior politicians, to decide what sanctions to impose. Is that a good idea in your opinion, or should that sanction regime ultimately be independent of politicians?
So if I can start with the beginning of your question about what I mean by eyes on men. If I can go back to what I talked about at the beginning about passive language. Most of our service system has been designed to move women around. We really started the response to domestic violence was the establishment of women's refuges. So what do we do? We move women around. And one of the most appalling examples I heard about that was in Cairns, when I met with one of the high-risk teams there, and they were talking about a bloke who wasn't really very visible to much of the system. And what they knew was that when they pieced it together, 5 women and their children over a period of time had needed to be flown out of Cairns to make them safe, rather than addressing what needed to happen around that man's behaviour. So much of our system is designed around eyes on women. Women have much more help-seeking behaviour. Women are much more visible to the system. Men often don't. If they put up their hand and say, I'm concerned about my behaviour, as I said, there's not much around to respond to them. So, and where we have seen some of the best successes in keeping women safe is when you talk to then there are high-risk versions of high-risk teams all over the country. It's when they know and they've got an eye on the man, not just What are we doing about? We do risk assessments on women. We talk about how do we help manage women's risk and safety. We don't do risk assessments in the same way about men and their behaviour. So I mean it very practically, actually, when I say eyes on men, and that we need to think about our system in ways that sometimes I get asked when that are we talking about more men? Is there a risk that we're moving funding away from women, that we're taking eyes off the critical need for response services and the services and systems for women? My response to that is, unless we start doing that, we're not keeping women safe. If the objective is to keep women and children safe, then we need to be doing the work with men more than we are.
Karen,
the parliamentary.
Can you just summarise your question again for me?
Yeah, so there's a new commission being proposed for the Parliament in which an independent commission will make recommendations to a committee of senior politicians in terms of sanctions for poor behaviour within the Parliament workplace. Is it a good idea to ultimately leave it up to what's called the Privileges Committee, the politicians, to impose those sanctions, or should it be independent of politicians, that process?
I think that's an interesting discussion we're having in a whole lot of different sectors about who has oversight and who can whether it needs to be independent. With regard to this, as you've said, it's new and I can't comment on the detail of it. What I would say is two things. One, every workplace is responsible for keeping itself safe and putting in place systems to make sure that it is safe for everybody who is in that workplace. And many workplaces around the country are thinking about how they do that. We'll need to watch this one and see whether it's effective and whether it does change those levels of safety.
Karen Middleton.
Hello, Commissioner. Thank you for your address. Karen Middleton from The Guardian, Australia. You spoke about the weaponisation of systems and how they're being used primarily against women. And I wanted to ask you about a specific example of that. It's been raised by the Economic Inclusion Advisory Committee, the government-appointed committee headed by Jenny Macklin that's made a report to government the last couple of years. One specific example they gave in that report twice now was on the intersection between child support and family tax benefits, and how ex-partners were manipulating the timing and amounts of their payments to rob single mothers primarily of the full amount of family tax benefit. But it also found that that the system was structured badly for those women, that there is a requirement for the women receiving family tax benefit to first claim the child support from the ex-partner before they can get the family tax benefit. There's an exemption for women who are experiencing violence, but the definition is difficult and a lot of women are not meeting the test. So they're being required to contact their ex-partners, sometimes in a situation where there's been financial abuse. And the report has found that this is perpetuating violence against women. Now, as I understand it, nothing's been done about that yet. I would have thought, given there have been 2 warnings about it, that there was an obligation on government to do something. Can you speak to that specific example, what you think about that, and whether we need a comprehensive audit of all government support payments and the accountability systems in them to ensure they are not making the circumstances of women worse?
So you've described that example very well, so I don't need to go into more detail, and you're quite right. And it's a very good example of breaking down where the detail of how systems that you would never occur to most people, that they could be weaponised and cause harm. And I think one of the things that we have seen and heard at the Commission is the way many systems are weaponised in that way. I am aware that work is underway to do the kind of audit broadly across systems, to government systems, to make sure that government is thinking about how those things can and are causing harm. So I'm aware that work is underway and we will be keeping an eye on that.
Ashley Raper.
Hello, Ashley Raper from Network 10. In terms of the resourcing of frontline services and crisis services, is the reality that there just needs to be a whole lot more funding given by the government to meet this plan? Or can it be more strategic? And if so, how does it go about prioritising?
So I think it's a bit of both, and Ashley, I think that all governments, state and territory, Commonwealth government, are looking at and need to look at where they need to strategically fund the service system, because, and in order to do that, as I said at the beginning, we need better data. We need better data. We need to be thinking about absolutely funding what we know works. And we need to be evaluating every program. We need to make sure that it's built into program contracts, that everything is evaluated, and then that those evaluations are shared publicly. Because one of the things that we have, again, surprisingly heard as we've been around different jurisdictions is the thirst to hear about what's working in different states and territories, and that's not happening as much as we would like it to. So I think there needs to be greater sharing of good practice. We need to be evaluating so that we know that we are targeting funding in a strategic way, and there absolutely needs to be an uplift.
Anna Henderson.
Anna Henderson, SBS World News. I just wanted to ask you about that frontline response when it happens in an acute family or domestic violence situation and often the police are at the door. What do you think would be the best approach in that situation to have the right kind of trained people there to respond?
There's some very good examples and work being done around co-responder models at the moment. So we need a number of things. We need everybody who shows up to that response situation to be better trained, not just a short program. We need it to be updated regularly every year. So we need police and frontline responders to be better trained, but we also need specialists in some instances. And there are some great examples currently being implemented across the country in looking at co-responder models, which I think show enormous promise.
Thank you.
Amanda Kopp.
Hi, Amanda Kopp from 9 News. You say we need to be having different conversations with men and boys. This speech and this report is perhaps an opportunity to start having some of those conversations. So tonight at the dinner table, what conversations do fathers and parents need to be having with their sons?
I was listening to a blog the other day, a podcast blog of a number of men talking to each other and recognising that they'd been challenged by the women in their lives about not that they weren't really bringing this up, that they weren't asking the women in their lives about do they feel safe, when do they not feel safe. And one of the examples that was used in the discussion was, and it was in response, they were talking about the stabbing at Bondi Junction and talking about, and I remember turning up to a train station to get a train to work and having a slightly kind of hyper-vigilant response myself to getting off the train into a crowd and crowded space and being aware of that sense of not feeling safe in a public space. And what these men were having a conversation with each other about was checking in with the women in their lives, and one of them said he did talk to his partner about walking, and one of the examples they used was walking down the street, and that and he asked her about walking down the street behind a woman and whether or not he should continue or cross the road. And she said, absolutely, you should cross the road. Absolutely, you should be the one. She shouldn't have to be the one that crosses the road. So that, you know, that lack of awareness, that walking down the street at night, that women are hyper-vigilant about what's going on around them, it's checking in. The conversation needs to be, so I think there are a couple of things. Checking in with the women in their lives about behaviours and what helps, but also what is it, how do you have a conversation with those men about, and boys, about expressing themselves and their feelings safely, and what is it that they need, and what is it that they need in terms of thinking about what is it to be a good man. We don't have enough of those conversations.
Thank you.
Evelyn Manfield.
Hi, Commissioner. Evelyn Manfield from the ABC. You've obviously got a lot of politicians in the room, and we're not sort of too far from an election. What would you like to see the major parties commit to put men's violence against women in the spotlight throughout an election campaign?
I think we are seeing, I think what's been really interesting this year has been the groundswell as a result of the rallies of governments around the country recognising, premiers, prime ministers standing up and saying we need to do better. I want this to be an election issue. I want this to be something that parties are recognising they need to put their best foot forward and committing to what we will see in future terms. And I think we're seeing that. I think that, as I said before, I think the National Plan is a good foundation, but we need to be thinking about how do we build on that going forward.
Tessa Connery.
Thank you very much for your time today. You spoke about language earlier on in your speech, and the language and conduct of politicians is back in the spotlight with the introduction of that new legislation we heard about earlier. Do you believe that the way Australia's political leadership conduct themselves sets the standard for the rest of the nation? And is there a link to broader community attitudes and behaviour?
I think all leaders need to step up and be thinking about their language. And that was why I started the speech in that way, because I think that we all use language in a way that has become acceptable, that we need to be challenging and thinking about. I do think that we need to see all of our leadership across political spheres, across the business sector, across sports and community leadership, faith-based leadership, talking in ways that are inclusive, that are celebrating diversity, that are celebrating and thinking about healthy masculinity, at the same time as fiercely saying the safety of our women and children is critically important, and we are going to make that a real priority.
Ellen Ransley.
Commissioner, Ellen Ransley from The Nightly. Thank you for your address. You've touched today on the problem of social media, and one of the byproducts of that has been the rise of incel ideology. I'm wondering if you can talk through any conversations you've had in the last year or so about how real of a concern that is, and given how prolific it's come to be on social media, do you think there should be greater regulation?
I think it is deeply concerning. I think that we are seeing evidence of radicalisation of young people and young men in particular. We've seen research about young men's attitudes, Australian young men's and boys' attitudes around women's rights and how far they've gone are actually not good. We've got some of the worst. We are leading in a bad way in some ways in the world. It's something we absolutely need to be paying attention to. And I think we need to recognise too the other things that are happening in the context at the moment. So we're not really talking anymore about the pandemic and the impact of young people of being isolated for many years and what the impact that's had on their mental health. And we need to be talking broadly about the context. Social media is a tool. That's all it is. It's a really good way to push out information, but it's also an opportunity. It's also an opportunity for engaging with. And young people live their lives in the internet in a way that, certainly not the way I grew up. What we need to be doing is to listen to those young people about what's going to work for them. And I think we need to be, I think the E-Safety Commissioner does an incredible job of, again, world-leading leadership around what we need to do, around bringing down the most hateful and harmful, but being constructive around engaging with communities around what's going to work for you.
If I could just butt in there, just when you were talking about radicalisation, just in the last week we've seen a discussion in the UK about actually starting to treat domestic violence as a form of terrorism. I just wondered whether you'd had a chance to have a look at what that discussion was and reflect on it.
That discussion also came up after the Bondi stabbings about whether it should be treated as terrorism. And I think my response to that would be that we need to be taking it as seriously. We need to be using all of the tools that are available to us that we use for terrorism. We have some incredible tools that the police have, that we have, in terms of social media, in terms of, watching who's buying fertiliser at Bunnings and tracking things. And I think one of the things that we need to get better at is information sharing. The business sector have a phenomenal amount of information that can be brought together to be keeping an eye on men. So I think we need to use the tools. I think we need to take it as seriously as we take terrorism. It is not terrorism. in the same way. And I think that what we need is for the community to take as seriously threats of domestic, family and sexual violence as they take terrorist threats, act on them as urgently, and recognise that they are different. If we called Molly Ticehurst's murder terrorism, then most of the community would be shaking their head and going, what are you talking about? That doesn't make sense to me. If we took the tools that we have to the risk assessment about her puppy was killed, all of the things that led up to, if we were watching that the way we watch people who are labelled as terrorists in our communities, then she might still be alive today.
Shalala Medora.
Thank you for your speech. The report, perhaps rightly, focuses on young people who might have already displayed problematic behaviour, toxic attitudes, perhaps they're already on the pathway towards violence, and what programs work for them. Connor Paul, the amazing Connor Paul, who you brought up, told us that one of the biggest gaps in the system is that there isn't genuine early intervention for people who might not have gone down that pathway, particularly young people who were victims of domestic violence in their own right, but haven't displayed any problematic behaviour as yet, but who still carry personal trauma. I wanted to get your take on that and to get a sense of whether you think, or what you think needs to be done in that particular space.
So I think that we need to be listening to Connor Paul and other young people around what have their experiences been and where were the points of intervention that would have made a difference for them. Where were the opportunities for provision of services for someone to have listened and talked to them that would have made a difference to them. And they're not necessarily the usual places. And then we need to go and make sure that we are providing resources into those bits of the system, whether it's at school, whether, as I said before, the health sector is we've got a huge opportunity. If we activate the health sector, given the size of that workforce, given the resources that go into it, if that became a tool for early intervention, for thinking about domestic, family and sexual violence in a different way, we could transform our responses, particularly for young people.
Natasha Chrysanthos.
Thank you. On the topic of conversations, there's been some criticism from people working in the sector that perhaps Australia has focused too much on conversations in the last 10 years and overemphasised the importance of talking at the expense of more tangible policy changes around things like gambling, alcohol and pornography that can sometimes exacerbate violence. What's your view on that argument? Is there a limit to the dinner time conversation approach? And do you think there needs to be more action on those other policy areas that aren't always tied to domestic violence?
I think you're absolutely right. Dinner time conversations can only take you so far, and individual action can only take you so far. We need systemic responses. We need systemic responses that look at where are the big levers that can be pulled. And I think that that's one of the things that we are very keen to see, is that we are looking at every point that we can be making policy changes that can make a difference. And you've identified some of them. Gambling, drug and alcohol regulation, I think, are some of the things that we need to be absolutely having more of a conversation about.
And gambling, for example, is one that's a big topic politically at the moment. Do you think there needs to be very strong action there, and what would that look like if we're talking about reducing violence?
I think it's a very important conversation that we're having, and I'm very pleased to see the advocacy that has been happening around gambling restrictions and how much greater community conversation about understanding the impact that gambling has on family, domestic and sexual violence, the impact that drug and alcohol does, and what we can do as a community to change that and address it.
Jessica Wang.
Thank you, Commissioner. Jessica Wang from Newswire. You spoke about the need to reduce the use of passive language in this space. The term domestic violence, or DV, is very broadly used. How can we change the language we use around these offences to emphasise the brutality and the effect on the lives of victim survivors? And will you speak to what you recommend as the best practice or the best terms to reflect that?
That's a really good question, because I think it's a really tricky one, isn't it? I mean, if we go, it's one of the things, I was having a conversation with someone the other day about what we have learnt in terms of the way we talk about suicide. and what we've learnt about the importance of both having the conversation but being aware that it can be risky and dangerous for communities as well. We have the same issue when we talk about domestic, family and sexual violence. We know that there are risks of backlash, there are risks of copycat. We know that where there have been some really graphic, traumatic instances occur, that actually it's caused ripple effects for other women who call up services saying, I've just had threatened to me, I'm going to do the same thing to you. So we need to be very mindful in the way we talk about, I think, domestic, family and sexual violence. We need to be talking about it in a way that holds the people who use violence accountable, but respectful of, and absolutely respectful of the women, and not labelling them in terms of what's happened to them. And there are some very good guidelines that exist about that we need to be ensuring that media and anybody who has leadership around communicating about it is well educated in.
Emma Myers.
Hi, I'm Emma from the Community Broadcasting Association of Australia. We know that women with disabilities are twice as likely to experience sexual and physical violence. They also face additional challenges such as withholding medications, having their mobility devices taken away from them. What help, if any, is available to them, and how can we implement stronger prevention and intervention tactics to support these women?
Thank you for your question. I think it's a very important one, and again, I think it's something that we need to do more work, and there needs to be more recognition of the issues that you've raised. I think the Disability Royal Commission talked about the need for interventions and strategies, and thinking about how we pay more attention to the elevated risk that women with a disability experience regularly, and the lack of service responses that are appropriate for them. I would agree with what you've said, and just say that we need to be doing more, and that that's one of the things, again, if I can just say back to the importance of, when we are talking about lived experience engagement, that we are talking about a diverse experiences that are being heard, that we make sure that when we are consulting about services for and issues around women with a disability, that we are engaging with lived experience who have those experiences, that we are clear about talking to people who have the specific kinds of experiences that we need to be hearing from. And that's something the Commission will absolutely be prioritising.
Commissioner Cronin, thanks so much for talking to us today.
Thank you.